2 words. That was all it took to break her in front of the entire kingdom. I reject you. The Alpha King said it the way a man closes a door. Quiet. Final. And hundreds of wolves beneath the silver banners forgot how to breathe. She did not weep. She did not beg. She lifted her chin while they laughed. And one of them whispered the cruelest thing of all, that even the moon had rejected her. But the moon was listening. And the moment those words left their lips, the cold changed. The flames bent low. The silver banners snapped like whips. And high above the kingdom that had just thrown away a forgotten girl with no name, something ancient, something patient, something that had been watching for far longer than anyone knew, slowly opened its eyes. The words landed before the wind could carry them away. I reject you. Caspian Thorn said it the way a man closes a door, quiet, final, certain, and the whole courtyard seemed to forget how to breathe. Hundreds of wolves stood beneath the silver banners. The full moon hung swollen and bright above the ridge, spilling pale light across the stone. Somewhere a torch hissed. Somewhere a child shifted against a mother's leg. But Marin Holloway heard none of it. She heard only her own heart, pounding like something trying to escape. She stood at the center of it all. The girl with no family name worth remembering. The one they whispered about. The one who had spent 22 years learning exactly where she belonged in the eyes of this kingdom. Nowhere. The cold pressed against her cheeks. The scent of pine smoke and frost filled the air, and beneath it, faint and unwelcome, the warm musk of the Alpha King himself. Cedar, storm rain, something darker she had no name for. It curled around her senses and made her stomach tighten, even now. Even here. Even as he cast her aside. She hated that her body still noticed him. Marin lowered her eyes. She should have expected this. She had always known where the night would end. And still, some small, foolish part of her had dared to hope. That was the mistake. Hope made the falling so much sharper. The high priest stepped forward, his ceremonial robes whispering across the platform. His voice rolled out over the gathering like a stone dropped into still water. The Alpha King has spoken. The bond is denied. The murmurs began at once. Marin felt them more than she heard them. Dozens of stares pressing against her skin like cold fingers. A few of the noble women exchanged satisfied little smiles. One covered a laugh behind a jeweled hand. The sound of it slipped under her ribs and stayed there. She lifted her chin anyway. Her hands trembled at her sides. She curled them into the folds of her cloak so no one would see. Not here. Not in front of them. Not in front of him. Caspian watched her, and something in his chest refused to settle. He told himself it was nothing. He had done what the crown required. He had weighed bloodline and strength and the future of the pack, and he had chosen the sensible path. A king did not bond with a forgotten Omega from the outer territories. A king did not let instinct override duty. So why did his wolf pace beneath his skin like a caged thing? Why did the air taste different the moment she had stepped into the moonlight? There had been a scent, just a thread of it, drifting toward him as the herald called her name, wild and clean, sweet like rain on warm earth. It had reached into some old buried place inside him and pulled, and for one breathless second, He had nearly forgotten his own name. He had crushed the feeling, buried it, spoken the rejection before it could take root. Now she stood there with her chin raised and her eyes dry, and he could not look away. She was not begging. That surprised him. Most would have wept. Most would have crumbled. But this girl simply held herself together with nothing but her own spine. And somehow that was harder to watch than tears would have been. Caspian's jaw tightened. He looked toward the horizon instead. It was easier than meeting her gaze. "You may return home," the king said. Home. The word felt strange in Marin's chest. She was not entirely sure where that was anymore. She took one step back, then another. The crowd parted eagerly, opening a path before her, as though she carried some invisible stain they feared might brush against them, as though rejection were a sickness they could catch. Each step felt heavier than the last. The marble was cold through the thin soles of her shoes. The banners snapped overhead, and above the platform, the great stone statue of the moon goddess watched the whole scene with her serene carved face turned forever toward the sky. Marin had spoken to that face as a child. On the long, lonely nights when no one else would listen, she had whispered her questions into the dark. Why am I different? Why do I never quite fit? Why does it feel like everyone else was handed a place? And she was simply left over. The statue had never answered. It did not answer now. She reached the edge of the gathering, and a clear, sweet voice cut through the cold. "Leaving so soon." Marin froze. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned. Seraphine Vance stood near the heart of the crowd, ringed by noble women in gowns the color of frost and deep water. Golden hair, perfect posture, the easy confidence of a woman who had never once been questioned in her life. She smiled. There was nothing kind in it. "I only wanted to offer my congratulations," Seraphine said. The women around her tittered. Not everyone gets rejected by a king. In front of an entire kingdom. The laughter spread. It rippled out across the courtyard like fire crossing dry grass, and Marin felt the heat rise to her face. She forced her breathing slow. She had practiced this. Years of practice. The art of letting cruel words pass through her without leaving a mark. But Seraphine stepped closer, and her perfume reached Marin first. Heavy roses and cold metal. The scent of someone who had never wanted for anything. "You know what surprises me most?" Seraphine tilted her head, almost gentle. "That you actually believed you belonged here." More laughter. Marin's fingers tightened in her cloak. For one heartbeat, she imagined turning, speaking, saying all the things that lived behind her teeth. But she was so tired. Tired of proving she deserved ordinary kindness. Tired of pretending the words did not land. So she shook her head and turned away. That should have ended it. It did not. "Even the moon rejected her," Seraphine called out, bright and sweet. The courtyard exploded with laughter, and Marin stopped walking, not because she chose to, because something inside her simply gave. She looked up at the moon, the same moon she had spoken to 1,000 nights, the one constant in a life that had given her so little. And hearing that woman bind it to her shame felt unbearably personal, like a hand closing around the last thing she had left. She swallowed hard. She made herself move. Behind her, the laughter went on, and then the cold changed. It came without warning, a wind that was not winter wind, deeper, older. It swept across the courtyard and dropped the temperature so suddenly that guests gasped and pulled their cloaks tight. The silver banners snapped like whips above the palace. The laughter died in a single breath. Marin paused on the marble stair. The wind carried a scent she had never smelled before, and yet somehow knew. Wildflowers, rain, something ancient that made a light bloom strangely beneath her breastbone, low and steady, like a second heartbeat waking after a long sleep. She pressed a hand to her chest. Behind her, the murmurs turned uneasy. One by one, faces lifted toward the sky. Even Seraphine's smile faltered. Marin raised her eyes. High above the kingdom, the moon burned brighter than it had any right to, and around its edge, a thin ring of gold had begun to appear. Caspian felt it before he understood it. The bond inside him, the one he had denied an hour ago, lurched against his ribs as though something far away had called its name. His wolf went still. The hair rose along his arms. He looked up at the gold spreading across the moon, and for the first time that night, certainty deserted him. He searched the crowd for her without meaning to, but the path had already closed. The forgotten girl had slipped beneath the great gates and out of the light, and the kingdom did not yet know what it had let walk away. The wind moved through the courtyard one last time, carrying that ancient scent. And somewhere beyond the clouds, far above the kingdom that had laughed, something old, something patient, something that had waited 22 years, finally opened its eyes. The palace had not slept. By the time the gold first touched the moon, the celebration that should have crowned the night had already curdled into something else. The musicians had stopped playing. The wine sat untouched in its cups. And in the great hall beneath the carved rafters, the royal council gathered in tight, anxious knots, their voices low and sharp. Caspian Thorn stood at the head of the long table and listened to men argue about a sky none of them understood. "It is an omen," one elder insisted. "Nothing good follows a moon that bleeds gold." "It is a coincidence," said another, though his hands would not stay still. "It followed the ceremony," a third murmured. "It followed the rejection." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Caspian said nothing. He had spent his whole life trusting his instincts. They had carried him through battles other men did not survive. They had told him when to strike and when to wait, when a smile hid a knife. And tonight, every instinct he owned was screaming at him in a language he could not translate. He kept thinking of the way the air had changed when she walked away. He kept thinking of that scent. The doors opened, and Seraphine Vance swept into the hall like she already owned it. She had changed her gown. Of course she had. Deep silver now, threaded with something that caught the torchlight and threw it back. Her golden hair was pinned high, her chin lifted, her composure flawless. The earlier disruption had not shaken her. If anything, she looked pleased, the way a hunter looks when the prey finally tires. "Your Majesty," she said, and lowered herself into a graceful bow. Caspian inclined his head. Nothing more. "The kingdom is frightened," Seraphine went on, straightening. Her voice was warm honey poured over cold steel. "The people see strange signs in the sky, and they look to their king for steadiness, for certainty." She let the words settle. The ceremony was interrupted, but that does not change the duty of the crown. Several council members nodded at once. The Vance family had spent years preparing the ground for this moment, planting seeds, calling in favors, whispering in the right ears. Many in the room had long believed Seraphine would stand at the king's side. She believed it most of all. An engagement, one elder said slowly, would calm the pack, show them the bloodline endures, show them order has not broken. Stability, another agreed. Seraphine's lips curved, just slightly. Caspian felt the bond in his chest twist, a dull ache that had not left him since the courtyard. He did not understand it. He had rejected the Omega. The matter was closed, and yet some buried part of him recoiled from the idea forming around this table. Recoiled hard, like a hand pulled back from flame. "Your Majesty?" Seraphine prompted, soft and certain. He opened his mouth. He did not get the chance to answer. The first sign was the cold. It poured through the high windows without a single one of them opening. The torches along the walls bent sideways, flames stretching thin, and then, one by one, the great hearth fires guttered low. Breath fogged in the air. Frost crept across the rim of an abandoned wine cup. And then the messenger came. He half ran, half stumbled through the doors, pale as bone, his chest heaving. "Your Majesty," he gasped. The whole council turned. The sacred flame in the inner sanctuary. He could barely shape the words. "It has gone out." Silence dropped over the room like a heavy cloth. The sacred flame had burned for longer than any living wolf could remember. Longer than the kingdom that had a name. Every child grew up on stories of it. It was the moon goddess's blessing made visible, the proof that the heavens had not forgotten them. And now it was dark. "That is not possible," the high priest whispered. "There is more," the messenger said, and his voice cracked. "The old chamber beneath the sanctuary, the sealed one." The wall opened, on its own. Edric Crow rose slowly from his place near the wall. He was a quiet man, the kind who lived among dusty records and rarely spoke unless it mattered. He had served 3 kings and outlasted 2 of them, and in all that time, no one had ever seen the color drain from his face the way it did now. "Sealed chambers," he said softly, "do not open by accident." Far below the palace, beyond the gates, Marin Holloway had not gone far. She had meant to. She had crossed the lower road and reached the stone overlook above the valley, where the city lights scattered below like fallen stars. She had stood there a long time with her hands on the cold rail, letting the tears come at last, where no one could see them, where no one could judge. And then the light beneath her breastbone had refused to fade. It pulsed now, low and steady, a second heartbeat that was not entirely her own. The strange scent of wildflowers and rain still clung to the air, though there was nothing blooming this high, this late, this cold. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and felt it answer. "You are imagining things," she whispered. She did not believe herself. The sound of hooves found her before the riders did. She turned, and the world tilted. A column of pack guards came up the road from the palace, fast and grim, their banners snapping. And at their head, mounted on a horse the color of midnight, Caspian Thorn. Marin's stomach dropped. Her first instinct was to run. Her second, older and harder one, was to stand her ground and let them come. She had done nothing wrong. She had asked for nothing. She had walked away exactly as he had ordered her to. So she lifted her chin and waited. The guards fanned out around the overlook. Caspian swung down from the saddle, and the moment his boots struck the stone, the glow beneath her ribs flared so suddenly she nearly gasped. His scent reached her on the wind. Cedar, storm rain, that dark, unnamed thing beneath. Her whole body tightened against it, traitorous and warm, and she hated herself for the way her breath caught. Caspian stopped 3 paces from her and forgot, for a moment, why he had come. The bond hit him like a fist. It had ached all night, a dull pull he could ignore if he tried. But here, this close, with the wind carrying her scent straight into him, it was not a pull anymore. It was a current. It dragged at every muscle, every instinct, every careful wall he had built between duty and want. Wild and clean, sweet like rain on warm earth. His wolf surged toward the surface, and Caspian shoved it down so hard his jaw ached. She was looking at him, not the way the others looked at him, not with fear, not with hunger for favor, not with the careful flattery he had grown so tired of. She looked at him the way a person looks at a storm, wary, steady, refusing to flinch. It unsettled him more than any weapon could have. "You came back for me," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was low and even, though he could hear the strain underneath it. "The kingdom needs answers," he said. "And you think I have them." "I think," he said slowly, "that the sky began to change the moment you walked away. I think the sacred flame went dark while you stood on this road, and I do not believe in coincidence." Something flickered across her face, surprise, then a tired, bitter kind of amusement. "So now you want me," she said softly. "An hour ago, you could not be rid of me fast enough." The words landed exactly where she aimed them. Caspian held her gaze. He did not look away this time. "I want the truth," he said. "I don't have your truth." Her hands curled at her sides. "I have never had anything you wanted. You made that very clear." The wind rose between them, sharp and sudden, and Marin swayed. She did not mean to. The light beneath her breastbone had surged again, fierce and overwhelming, and for one dizzying second the edges of the world went soft. Her knee buckled. The cold rail slipped under her grasping fingers, and then his hand was around her wrist. It happened too fast for either of them to stop it. His grip was warm, impossibly warm against her chilled skin, and the instant their bodies touched, the bond between them roared to life like dry kindling meeting flame. Heat poured up her arm and bloomed through her chest. Her breath left her in a rush. The strange second heartbeat slammed against her ribs, suddenly loud, suddenly desperate, suddenly matched to the rhythm of his. She felt his pulse through his hand. She felt it answer hers. Caspian went utterly still. For one suspended moment, neither of them breathed. The wind howled around the overlook. The golden moon burned overhead, and the two of them stood frozen, joined by a single point of contact, while something ancient woke between them and refused to be denied. His thumb shifted, just barely, a slow drag against the soft inside of her wrist, as though he could not help himself. Marin's whole body lit up like struck flint. She wrenched her hand free. She stepped back so fast she nearly fell again, catching herself on the rail, her chest heaving. Her wrist burned where he had held it. The glow beneath her ribs throbbed, confused and aching, reaching toward him even as she put distance between them. "Don't," she said. Her voice shook. "Don't touch me." Caspian stared at his own hand as though it belonged to a stranger. He could still feel her pulse against his palm. He could still feel the way the bond had locked into place, instant and absolute, the way nothing in his disciplined life had ever locked into place before. No, he had rejected her. The bond was breaking. It had to be. He had spoken the words before the whole kingdom. This was something else, a trick of the strange night. Whatever ancient thing was loose in the world, twisting the moon and snuffing the sacred flame. That was all. That had to be all. He closed his hand into a fist and forced his face back into stone. "You will return to the palace," he said. Marin laughed. It came out raw. "So I can stand before your court again? So they can study me like an animal that wandered too close to the fire?" She shook her head. "I would rather walk into the dark." "It is not a request." "It never is with you." Their eyes met, and the air between them crackled. She should have been afraid. He was the Alpha King. He could command her, cage her, do anything he liked with a girl who had no name and no family to speak for her. Every instinct she had spent 22 years sharpening told her to lower her eyes and obey. She did not. "You stood before everyone tonight," she said quietly, "and you told them I was nothing. You let them laugh. You watched it happen, and you called it duty." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And now the sky changes, and suddenly you ride out into the cold to find the nothing you threw away." She took a breath. "So forgive me, Your Majesty, if I do not come running." The guard shifted, uneasy. No one spoke to the king this way. No one dared. Caspian felt his wolf stir again, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Respect. A low, dragging pull of it, threaded straight through the want he was trying so hard to deny. He had expected to find a frightened girl on this road. He had found a woman who would not bend. The decision was taken out of both their hands. A second rider came tearing up the road, and this one did not slow. "Your Majesty," he called, breathless. "The signs are spreading. The lower pack reports the hearth fires dying in every home. The people are gathering in the streets. They are afraid." He swallowed. "And the council has made an announcement. They have declared the engagement to the Lady Vance to calm the pack." Something flickered across Caspian's face. Marin saw it, a flinch, quickly buried, there and gone. And to her own horror, something beneath her ribs twisted sharp and sudden, a flare of feeling that was absurdly, impossibly like grief. As though some part of her had a claim, as though some part of her had been promised and then robbed. She pressed her hand to her sternum and despised herself for it. "He is nothing to you," she thought fiercely. "He rejected you. He chose her. He chose duty. He chose anyone but you." But the bond did not listen. The bond only pulled. "Take her to the palace," Caspian said. His voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a king who had remembered himself. "See that she is given a room, guarded but unharmed." "Yes, Your Majesty." He turned back to his horse. He did not look at her again. He could not. because if he looked at her again, he was not certain what his wolf would do. Maren stood very straight as the guards moved to flank her. She did not cry. She did not beg. She had run out of both years ago. But as the king mounted and the company turned back toward the palace, she lifted her eyes one last time to the golden moon and felt the light in her chest reach toward it like a child reaching for a hand in the dark. Somewhere far above, something patient was watching her still. And somewhere far below, in a kingdom lit by dying fires, a woman with golden hair smiled to herself and began to plan exactly how she would make the forgotten girl disappear for good. The room they gave her was finer than any she had ever slept in. That was almost the cruelest part. Maren Holloway sat on the edge of a bed wide enough for three, in a chamber hung with pale silk, and felt smaller than she ever had in the bare little room on the outskirts where she had grown up. A fire should have burned in the hearth. It did not. The logs sat cold and dark, refusing to catch no matter how many times the servant had tried. The whole palace was the same now. Every flame in the kingdom had thinned to almost nothing. Outside her door, 2 guards stood watch. She could hear them breathing, shifting, pretending not to listen. She drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, and she let the silence settle over her like snow. The light beneath her breastbone had not faded. If anything, it had grown. It pulsed there, steady and patient, and beneath it she kept hearing something. Not words, not quite. More like the memory of a voice she had known before she had language to name it. She closed her eyes and tried to listen, and the memories came instead. A small girl at the edge of a pack gathering, watching the other children play, never quite invited in. The way conversations dropped to whispers when she approached. The way grown wolves looked at her with pity, which was so much worse than cruelty, because pity meant they had already decided what she was. She remembered a winter when she had been sick, and no one had come. She remembered learning to braid her own hair in the dark, because there was no one to do it for her. She remembered talking to the moon, night after night, because the moon was the only thing that never turned away. Maren pressed her face against her knees. She had spent 22 years believing the problem was her, that she had been built wrong somehow, that everyone else had been handed a key to belonging, and she had simply been forgotten, left to stand outside the door, knocking at a world that would never open. Tonight had only confirmed it, in front of the entire kingdom, and yet that light in her chest did not feel like the warmth of something broken. It felt like the warmth of something waiting. Far across the palace, in a chamber lined with crumbling records, Caspian Thorne stood over an ancient scroll and felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he knew. Edric Crow had not slept. The old scholar's hands trembled as they moved across the brittle parchment, and his voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "This is not a prophecy, Your Majesty." Caspian waited. "It is a warning." The torchlight guttered. Even here, the flames could barely hold. Edric leaned closer to read, and the words he spoke seemed to age him with every line. "It speaks of a child, hidden, placed among ordinary wolves, in plain sight, with no name and no station to protect her." He swallowed. "A child of the heavens, set down among those who would not know her." Caspian's jaw tightened. Why hide such a child? Edric looked up. His eyes were wet. To test them, he said softly, to see how the kingdom would treat one who appeared to have nothing. No title, no power, no use. He looked back down at the scroll, and his finger trembled over a single line. She was to remain hidden until the day the kingdom judged her unworthy. The words dropped into the cold room and did not stop falling. Caspian felt his stomach turn to ice. A memory rose, unbidden. Marin standing alone beneath the moon. Marin refusing to weep while the court laughed. Marin on the overlook with her chin lifted, telling him to his face that he had called her nothing. And what happens, he heard himself ask, when she is judged unworthy? Edric read on. The further his eyes traveled, the paler he became. The blessing fails, he whispered. The flames die. The moon turns from silver. The heavens close. And the kingdom loses the goddess's protection. Until the wrong is set right. Silence. Caspian looked toward the high window, where the golden moon hung swollen and strange over a kingdom of dying fires. It is happening, he said. All of it. Tonight. Edric did not answer. He did not have to. The old scholar simply lowered the scroll and looked at his king with something close to grief. The heavens are not punishing us for what the sky does, he said quietly. They are punishing us for what we did to her. The first attack came before dawn. It began as a sound on the wind, a long, low note that was not wind at all, rolling down from the high passes north of the kingdom. The guards on the wall heard it first. Then the wolves in the lower pack lifted their heads, hackles rising, an old instinct waking in their blood. Something was coming. Word reached the palace within the hour, carried by a runner so winded he could barely stand. The Crovath pack, he gasped. They are moving, hundreds of them, crossing the northern border. The council erupted. The Crovath had been pressed back generations ago, driven into the cold lands beyond the passes, held at bay only by the strength of the kingdom and the protection of the moon. For as long as anyone could remember, they had not dared to cross. They had not been able to. But the blessing was failing now, and the Crovath could smell it. They know, Edric said grimly, standing at Caspian's side. They can feel the protection thinning. They have waited a very long time for a night like this. Caspian closed his eyes for one heartbeat. A failing blessing. A hostile pack on the move. A court fracturing with fear. And somewhere in this very palace, a girl he had thrown away who might be the only thing that could set it all right. He had never in his life felt so much slipping through his hands at once. Ready the warriors, he said. Every wolf who can fight. We hold the lower valley. The council scattered to obey. Caspian remained a moment longer, staring at the cold hearth. He thought of the way her pulse had felt against his palm. He thought of how hard he had tried to deny it. And for the first time, the king began to wonder if the greatest mistake of his life had already been made. Hours ago, in a courtyard full of silver banners. The fighting reached the lower pack faster than anyone expected. The Crovath did not come like an army. They came like a storm. They poured down through the darkened waves, and the failing blessing left the kingdom's wolves weaker than they had ever been, their bond to the moon flickering like the dying fires in their homes. Marin felt it from her guarded room. She felt the fear move through the palace like a tide. She heard the shouting, the running feet. the distant clash of bodies in the valley below, and the light in her chest, which had been so steady all night, began to pull, not toward the king this time, toward the pain. She rose without deciding to. She crossed to the door and found it unguarded. The men who had watched her had been called to the fighting like everyone else. The corridor beyond stood empty and cold. She should have stayed. She knew that. A girl with no name and no power had no place near a battlefield. Every careful instinct she had built over 22 years told her to close the door and wait and survive, the way she always had. But the pull in her chest was stronger than her fear, so she followed it. She found them in the great hall. The wounded had been carried up from the valley, laid out across the cold stone floor in rows that grew longer with every passing minute. The air was thick with the copper scent of blood and the sharp tang of fear. Wolves moved among the fallen, doing what little they could, and the few healers in the kingdom were already overwhelmed. Maren stopped in the doorway, and there, on the floor near the far wall, she saw a child, a boy, no more than 6. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps, and a dark stain spread across the cloth pressed to his side. His mother knelt over him, and Maren knew her face at once. It was one of the women who had laughed in the courtyard, one of the noble wives who had covered her smile behind a jeweled hand while the king cast Maren aside. The woman was not laughing now. She was weeping over her son, begging him to hold on, and no one was coming, because there were too many wounded and not enough hands, and the boy was small, and the blessing was failing, and the healers had moved on to those they thought they could save. Maren crossed the hall before she knew her feet had moved. "Let me," she said. The mother looked up, and her tear-streaked face hardened with recognition. For one terrible second, even now, even here, the old contempt flickered behind her eyes. "You," the woman breathed. "Get away from him. You have no right." "Then watch me fail," Maren said softly. "But let me try." Something in her voice stopped the woman cold. Maren knelt. She did not know what she was doing. She had never healed anything in her life. But the light in her chest had become a roar now, surging down her arms, pooling in her palms, and the strange, ancient scent of wildflowers and rain rose around her, though there was nothing in the hall but blood and cold. She laid her hands over the boy's wound, and the world went quiet. The warmth poured out of her. She felt it leave her chest and travel through her hands and sink into the small broken body beneath them, gentle and certain, like water finding the cracks in dry earth. The boy gasped. A soft golden light spread out from beneath her palms, faint at first, then brighter, glowing through the gaps between her fingers and washing across the stone floor. The wolves nearest to her went still. The mother's weeping caught in her throat. Beneath Maren's hands, the bleeding slowed, then stopped. The torn flesh knit itself together, slow and seamless, and the gray pallor began to fade from the child's cheeks. His breathing deepened. His small fingers twitched, found the hem of Maren's sleeve, and held on. His eyes fluttered open. "Mama," he whispered. The hall erupted in gasps. Maren did not hear them. She was looking down at the boy's face, at the color returning to his lips, at the steady rise and fall of his chest, and something inside her was breaking open. not with pain, with wonder. She had spent her whole life believing she was empty, and here, pouring out of her hands, was something that could mend a child the kingdom had nearly let die. The mother stared at her. The contempt was gone now. In its place was something far harder for the woman to wear. Shame, raw, naked shame. The shame of someone who had mocked a girl in a courtyard and now owed that same girl the only thing that mattered in all the world. The woman's voice broke. I laughed at you. Tonight. In front of everyone. I know, Maren said. She did not say it cruelly. She did not say it kindly either. She simply said it. And then she gathered her strength and rose. And the boy in his mother's arms reached for her as she stood. All around the hall, faces were turning toward her. Wolves who had whispered about the forgotten Omega. Wolves who had decided long ago exactly what she was worth. They looked at her now the way a person looks at a sunrise they did not expect to live to see. And Maren, who had spent 22 years aching to be seen, found that being seen did not feel the way she had imagined. It did not fill the hole. It did not erase the years. The little girl who had grown up setting a second place at the table for no one, just to feel less alone, was still inside her. And no amount of awe in a stranger's eyes could reach back and hold that child. But the light in her chest glowed steady and sure, and for the first time, Maren understood that it had never been a sign of something broken in her. It had been a sign of something waiting to wake. Caspian found her there. He had returned from the valley to organize the defense, blood drying on his hands that was not his own, and he had stepped into the great hall to assess the wounded and stopped dead in the doorway. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by light, not torchlight. The fires were still dying. This light came from her, soft and golden, fading now, but unmistakable, the same gold that hung in the sky outside. The wounded around her were lifting their heads. The mother at her feet was weeping with a child held safe against her chest. And the forgotten Omega stood among them all with her chin lifted and her hands still glowing faintly, looking less like a girl who had been rejected, and more like something the kingdom should have fallen to its knees before. The bond in Caspian's chest pulled so hard he had to brace a hand against the doorframe. He understood in that moment, with a certainty that hollowed him out. The scroll had not been speaking of a stranger. It had been speaking of her, the child of the heavens, hidden among ordinary wolves, the one the kingdom would judge unworthy, the one whose rejection would darken the moon and snuff the sacred flame and tear the protection from the land. He had done that. He had stood before the whole kingdom and called her nothing, and the heavens had answered. Maren felt his gaze before she saw him. She turned, and their eyes met across the crowded hall, over the rows of the wounded and the weeping and the saved. The light in her chest leapt toward him, traitorous and bright, and she saw the same recognition dawn in his face that had been dawning in hers all night. He knew now. She could see it. He knew what she was. And the strangest thing of all was that it changed nothing about the way she felt. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel triumphant. She looked at the king who had thrown her away, now staring at her like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet, and what she felt, mostly, was tired. Tired of being measured. tired of being weighed and found wanting, and then suddenly, conveniently, found precious the moment she proved useful. She had healed that child because the child was dying, not to prove anything, not to win back a court that had laughed at her, not even to win back him. She had done it because she could, because somewhere beneath all the years of being told she was nothing, she had always known she was something. She had simply needed the moon to remind her. Outside, the long, low note of the Crovath sounded again. Closer now. The battle was not over. It had barely begun. The blessing was still failing. The moon still gold. The kingdom still teetering on the edge of a darkness it did not understand. And somewhere beyond the clouds, the patient presence that had watched Maren her whole life stirred toward waking. But in the great hall, for one suspended moment, none of that mattered. There was only a girl who had finally felt her own light, and a king who finally understood, far too late, exactly what he had let walk away from him beneath the silver banners. Caspian took one step toward her. Maren turned away. Not in anger, not even in pride. She turned away because she had spent her whole life waiting for someone to see her. And she had just discovered the one thing no one had ever told her, that the seeing had to start with herself. And outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain, and the sound of an enemy at the gates. The bond did not care that he had broken it. That was the cruelest discovery of the night. Caspian Thorn had believed the words ended it. He had stood before the kingdom and spoken the rejection, and a rejection was supposed to sever the thread before it ever truly formed. That was the law of it. That was how it had always been. But the thread had not been cut clean. It had been torn. And a torn bond, he was learning, did not fade quietly. It burned. It began in the valley, in the thick of the fighting. A pain bloomed in his chest, sharp and sudden, as though a hand had closed around his heart and squeezed. It dropped him to one knee in the middle of the battle line. His warriors thought he had been struck. He had not. The blow had come from somewhere far behind him, somewhere within the palace walls. It had come from her. He understood it the moment the pain eased and then surged again, in a rhythm that was not his own. Wherever Maren was, whatever she felt, he felt the echo of it now. The bond they shared had been ripped, but not yet killed, and a dying bond bled into both of them, raw and relentless. He fought through it. He had no choice. The Crovath did not pause because a king was in pain, but every time the bond flared, his eyes turned toward the palace on the hill, and he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that she was feeling the same fire. She was. Maren had not returned to her room. After the great hall, after the light and the saved child and the king's stunned face, she had slipped away through a side passage to be alone, because being alone was the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. And then the pain had found her. It started low in her chest, where the light had glowed all night, and twisted into something fierce and aching. It came in waves. Each one stole her breath. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of an empty corridor and slid down to the floor, both hands clutched over her heart. It was not her pain. She understood that almost at once. It came from outside her, from somewhere far below, from the valley where the fighting raged. It carried the shape of him, his exhaustion, his fear, well hidden, but there. the grinding effort of a man holding a line he was not certain he could hold. She felt all of it. And worse, she felt how her own heart reached toward it. No, she whispered into the dark. She did not want this. She did not want to feel him. She did not want her body to ache for a man who had thrown her away in front of the world. The bond had no right. He had rejected it. He had rejected her. And still it pulled. The battle broke near dawn. The Crovath fell back into the high passes, bloodied but not beaten, and the kingdom's wolves limped home with the grim knowledge that they had only bought time. The blessing was still failing. The enemy would come again, stronger, and the next night might not end so kindly. Caspian climbed the hill to the palace with his warriors, and the bond dragged at him with every step. He found her by following it. He did not mean to. He told himself he was simply walking the corridors, checking the wounded, doing the 1,000 small duties of a king after battle. But his feet carried him down a side passage he had no reason to take, and there, slumped against the wall, pale and shaking, was Marin. She looked up as he approached, and the bond, the moment their eyes met, roared so loud that both of them gasped. For a long moment, neither moved. The corridor was empty. The torches had nearly died, leaving only a thin blue light that came from somewhere high and cold. The whole palace seemed to hold its breath around them. Caspian crossed the distance slowly. He lowered himself to the floor an arm's length from her, his back against the same wall, and the closeness of him made the light in her chest flare so bright it almost hurt. His scent washed over her. Cedar, storm rain, blood and exhaustion beneath it now, and under all of that, the deep, dark, unnamed note that called to something in her she could not silence. "You feel it too," he said. It was not a question. Yes, there was no point in lying. Her voice came out raw. "Every time whatever you were doing down there, I felt all of it. The rejection should have killed it clean," he said quietly, like a confession. "It did not. It only cut deep enough to make it bleed. And a bond that bleeds like this does not heal. It dies slowly. I can feel it dying." Marin laughed, low and bitter and tired. "So this is my punishment," she said, "to ache for the man who threw me away, while the thing between us dies by inches." Caspian flinched. She saw it. "And what is mine?" he asked. She had no answer for that. He looked at his own hands for a while. The dried blood. The scars. The hands of a king who had spent his whole life making decisions that other people had to live with. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. "There was a moment tonight," he said slowly, "when I held the line in the valley, and I felt you pour something out of yourself to save a child who was not even yours. A child whose mother had laughed at you. I felt how it cost you, and I felt that you did it anyway." He turned his head and looked at her. "I have led this pack my whole life," he said. "I have measured wolves by their bloodline, their strength, their usefulness to the crown. I looked at you in that courtyard, and I saw an omega with no name, and I decided I already knew everything worth knowing about you." His jaw worked. "I was wrong." The words hung in the cold air. Marin had imagined this moment more than once tonight in the bitter corners of her mind. The great Alpha King admitting his mistake. She had imagined it would feel like victory, like vindication, like the world finally tilting back into balance. It did not feel like any of those things. It felt complicated. It felt heavy. It felt like a wound being touched by someone who had caused it. "You were wrong," she agreed softly. "But you only see it now. Now that the moon turned gold. Now that I glow in the dark and mend dying children. You did not see it an hour before that, when I was just the forgotten girl you could throw away without a second thought." "No," he admitted. "I did not." "Then forgive me," she said, "if your apology arrives a little late to mean what it should." He did not argue. That surprised her more than anything else could have. He did not defend himself. He did not list his reasons. He simply sat there in the dying light and took the weight of it, the way a man takes a blow he knows he has earned. And the bond, sensing his honesty, surged warm and bright between them. Maren felt it pull her toward him, felt her own body lean, just slightly, before she caught herself. The pain of the wounded bond had eased now that they were close. In its place came something far more dangerous: warmth, ease, the deep, drugging comfort of being near the one her soul had chosen, even as her mind screamed that her soul had chosen badly. "This is not fair," she whispered. "What it does, how it makes me feel, I know." His voice had gone low and rough. "I have spent the whole night fighting it. And losing." A long pause. "And losing," he admitted. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. The cold had crept into the corridor, but where their shoulders nearly touched, the air felt warm. Maren could feel the heat coming off him in waves. She could feel the bond drawing the breath from her lungs and slowing the beat of her heart until it matched his, the two rhythms folding into one. He shifted toward her. His hand came up, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. And then his fingers brushed a strand of hair back from her face, and the touch lit a fire that ran the length of her body. Her breath caught. "Maren," he said, just her name, but the way he said it, low and reverent, like a word he had been afraid to speak, undid something in her she did not know was holding. His thumb traced the line of her cheek, down to her jaw. The calloused warmth of it against her chilled skin made her shiver, and the shiver had nothing to do with the cold. The bond roared. Every nerve in her body strained toward him. His scent filled her until she could not think, until the years of loneliness and the night of cruelty and the ache of being unwanted all seemed to dissolve in the simple, overwhelming heat of being wanted now. He leaned closer. She felt his breath against her lips, and she wanted it. She wanted it so badly her whole body trembled with the wanting, to be held, to be chosen, to stop being alone for one single moment in a life that had given her almost none. His mouth hovered over hers. The bond begged her to close the distance. And then, in the warmth of him, in the heat of the moment she had dreamed of without admitting she dreamed of it, a quiet voice spoke inside her. Not the goddess, not the bond, her own. It asked her one question, soft and clear. Would he be leaning towards you now, if you still glowed like nothing in the dark? Maren went very still. The answer arrived before she could soften it. An hour ago, he had looked at her and seen an omega worth discarding. He had not leaned toward her then. He had not traced her face or whispered her name with reverence then. Nothing about her heart had changed since that moment in the courtyard. Nothing about her soul. The only thing that had changed was that the world had discovered she was valuable. And now, suddenly, he wanted her. Now, suddenly, they all did. She pulled back. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her body screamed against it. The bond wailed. Every cell in her ached to fall into him and let the warmth swallow the loneliness whole. But she pressed her palm flat against his chest and held the distance. "No," she said. Her voice shook, but it did not waver. Caspian froze. His eyes searched her face, dark and stunned, the bond visibly straining in him too. "Maren, you want me now," she said quietly. "I can feel it. The bond, your honesty, all of it. It is real. I believe that it is real." She drew a breath. "But you have to understand what I am hearing when you reach for me tonight." She lifted her chin. "An hour before the moon turned gold, you stood before the whole kingdom and called me nothing. And I was exactly the same person then that I am right now. The same heart, the same soul, the same girl who used to talk to the moon because there was no one else who would listen." Her voice cracked just slightly. She steadied it. "The only thing that changed is that you found out I was worth something." Caspian opened his mouth, closed it. He had no defense, and they both knew it. "If I let you hold me tonight," she went on, softer now, "I will always wonder. For the rest of my life, I will wonder whether you reached for me, or for the daughter of the heavens, whether you wanted Maren, or whether you wanted the girl who could save your kingdom." She shook her head. "And I have spent 22 years being wanted only when I was useful, being looked at only when I had something to give." Tears stood in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "I will not start my whole new life that way, not even with you, not even with the bond screaming at me to." The corridor was silent. The bond throbbed between them, raw and wounded and aching. And for once, Maren did not let it speak for her. "I have to choose myself first," she said, "before I can ever choose you. Even if it hurts, even if the bond never forgives me." She lowered her hand from his chest. "Maybe especially then." Caspian sat back against the cold wall. He felt the loss of her like a physical thing. The bond keened at the distance she had put between them, and his wolf paced and whined beneath his skin, and every instinct he owned demanded that he close the space again and prove to her that the wanting was true. But he did not move, because somewhere in the ruin of his pride, the king finally understood something. She was right. He had not earned her. Not yet. He had earned the moment in the courtyard, the rejection, the laughter he had allowed. He had earned the dying fires, and the failing blessing, and the long low note of an enemy at the gates, the reaching, the wanting, the reverent whisper of her name. None of it had been earned. It had simply been awakened, the moment she became precious. And a woman who had spent her whole life being valued only when useful had every right in the world to refuse a love that arrived on the same terms. "You are right," he said quietly. She blinked, startled. "You are right," he said again. He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no king in his face. Only a man who had been humbled all the way down to the bone. I do not get to touch you tonight. I do not get to be the comfort you have waited your whole life for. Not when I am the one who decided, only hours ago, that you were nothing worth keeping." He drew a slow breath. "If you ever choose me," he said, "I want it to be Marin who chooses. Not the bond, not the goddess, not gratitude. And I want to be a man who has actually earned it. Not one who only noticed your worth when the sky lit up to announce it." Something in Marin's chest loosened. It was not forgiveness. It was not surrender. It was simply the strange, fragile relief of being understood, of saying the hardest truth she owned and having it land, not on deaf ears, but on a man willing to sit in the discomfort of it. The bond ached between them still. It would ache for a long time, but for the first time, it ached alongside something steadier. Respect. The faint, fragile beginning of it. "Good," she said softly. She rose. Her legs were unsteady, but they held. She looked down at the king sitting against the wall in the blue dawn light, and she felt the pull of him, and she did not give in to it. "Good night, Caspian," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He felt it land like a touch. "Good night, Marin," he answered, and she walked away down the cold corridor, leaving him alone with the wounded bond and the dying fires and the long, hard understanding of exactly how much he had to make right. But far above the palace, where no one could see, golden eyes watched the girl walk away from the man her soul had chosen. And the patient presence that had guarded Marin her whole life felt something close to pride. The daughter of the heavens had just done the one thing the kingdom had never managed. She had refused to let her worth be decided by anyone but herself. The veil between the worlds grew thin, and the time for hiding was almost done. Power, when it begins to slip, does not go quietly. Seraphine Vance understood that better than anyone. She had spent her whole life learning the shape of power, where it pooled, who held it, how to stand close enough to catch the light it threw. She had been raised to believe the position of Luna was not a hope, but an inheritance, a thing already hers, waiting only for the ceremony to make it real. And now a nameless Omega was stealing it from her in the dark. She had felt it shift in the great hall. She had watched the wolves look at Marin Holloway with awe instead of contempt. She had heard the whispers change, and Seraphine, who knew the sound of power moving better than she knew her own heartbeat, had recognized the danger at once. The girl was rising, so the girl would have to fall. She did not act with rage. Rage was clumsy. Seraphine acted with patience. The way a spider works the edges of a web. She moved through the palace in the gray hours after the battle, and she spoke to the frightened and the grieving, and she planted a single seed in each ear she found. "Have you noticed," she would murmur, soft and sorrowful, "how all of this began the night she appeared?" She did not accuse. She only wondered aloud. The moon turned gold the moment she stood before the king. The sacred flame died as she walked away. The Crovath crossed the border that very night, after generations held back. A delicate pause. Strange, is it not? How the darkness follows her everywhere she goes. It was a lie woven from true threads. That was what made it dangerous, because every word she spoke had a grain of fact buried inside it, and frightened people do not weigh grains. They grab whatever explanation lets them sleep. And it is so much easier to fear a stranger than to face the truth that the kingdom's own cruelty had called down the dark. By midday, the whispers had spread. By dusk, they had teeth. Marin felt the change before she understood it. She had spent the day among the wounded, doing what she could, learning the strange new gift that lived in her hands. The light answered her now when she called it. She mended a torn shoulder, eased a fever, closed a wound that should have taken a healer a week. But somewhere in the afternoon, the gratitude in the room began to curdle. The mothers still let her near their children, but the others, the warriors, the elders, the frightened wolves crowding the lower halls, they had begun to look at her differently, not with awe now, with something colder. Their eyes followed her down the corridors. Their conversation stopped when she passed, the way they always had, except this time the silence had a sharper edge. She knew that silence. She had lived inside it her whole life. But this was worse. This silence was afraid. It came to a head in the great hall. She had gone to check on the boy she had saved, the one whose mother had wept over him, and she found a crowd already gathered. Dozens of wolves, faces drawn tight with fear and exhaustion and grief for the ones they had lost in the valley. And Seraphine stood at the center of them, lovely and grave, playing the part of a frightened noblewoman who only wished to protect her people. "There she is," someone said. The crowd turned. Marin stopped in the doorway. The light in her chest flickered, uneasy. "We were only speaking of you," Seraphine said, and her voice carried soft and sorrowful, pitched for the whole room to hear. "Of all the strange things that have come to us since the night you arrived." She tilted her head. "You must see how it looks. The golden moon, the dead flame, the enemy at our gates. All of it. Beginning with you." "I did not cause any of that," Marin said quietly. "No?" Seraphine's eyes glittered. "Then explain it. Explain why the heavens turned against us the moment the king turned you away. Explain the glow in your hands that no healer in living memory has ever possessed." She let the silence stretch. "Explain what you truly are." The crowd murmured, fearful, hungry for an answer that would let them stop being afraid. And Marin understood, in that cold and sickening moment, exactly what was happening. They had decided she was the curse. It was so much simpler than the truth. Caspian was not in the hall when it began. He was in the war chamber, where the news was even worse. Edric Crow spread the maps across the table, his old face grim. The Crovath had not retreated far. They were regrouping in the passes, and the scouts reported their numbers swelling by the hour. The next assault would come within the day, and it would be the last the kingdom could withstand. The blessing was nearly gone. The moon hung gold and silent. The wolves of the pack felt their bond to the heavens guttering like the dead hearth fires, and a pack that could not draw on the moon could not hold against an enemy that smelled blood in the water. "We need every warrior we have," Edric said. And even then, he did not finish. It was then that the messenger came from the Vance estate. The terms were laid out with cold precision. The Vance family commanded the largest body of warriors in the kingdom outside the crown itself. Generations of wealth had bought them loyalty, blades, and strength. And in this hour, when the kingdom needed every wolf, That strength had become a weapon Seraphine's father knew exactly how to aim. The Vance forces would join the defense, the messenger said, on 2 conditions. First, that the king honor the engagement to Seraphine, publicly and at once, to restore the order the people craved. And second, the messenger hesitated. And second, he said carefully, that the Omega, the one they are calling the source of the curse, be handed over to the family, to be dealt with, quietly, for the good of the pack. The war chamber went silent. Caspian stood very still. He understood the shape of the trap immediately. He needed the Vance warriors. Without them, the kingdom fell. The Crovath would pour through the gates, and there would be no pack left to save, no children, no elders, none of the wolves who depended on him to keep them breathing. All he had to do was give them Marin. Hand over one girl. A girl with no family to mourn her. A girl the frightened crowd had already decided to fear. A girl he had, only a day before, declared worth nothing at all. It would be so easy, and it would be the second time he threw her away to save his own crown. Caspian closed his eyes. He thought of the corridor, of her palm flat against his chest, of her voice, steady even as it shook, telling him she had spent her whole life being wanted only when she was useful, and that she would not begin her new life that way. If he handed her over now, he would prove her right about him forever. He would prove that her worth to him had only ever been a matter of usefulness. And the moment she stopped being useful, the moment she became inconvenient, he would trade her away like a coin. "No," he said. Edric looked up sharply. "Your Majesty, if we refuse the Vance forces, I know what we lose." Caspian's voice was iron. "I will not buy this kingdom with her life. I have already sold her once. I will not do it again." The messenger paled. "The family will not be pleased." "Then the family can explain to the dead," Caspian said, "why they kept their blades sheathed while the kingdom burned." And in another corridor of the palace, Marin knew none of it. She did not know that a king had just refused to trade her away for an entire army. She only knew that her hands were still warm from mending a man who had once turned his back on her in the street, and that she could not understand why giving had always come so easily to her, and being kept had come not at all. She pressed her warm palms together and stared at them in the dim light. All her life she had poured herself out for people who would not have crossed a room to catch her if she fell. And she was beginning to wonder, in the quiet, whether kindness given to the cruel was strength, or simply another way of asking, "Please, just this once, let me be worth keeping." She did not have the answer yet, but the question would matter very soon. Because Seraphine had never intended to wait for permission. That was the thing about a woman who believed a position was hers by right. She did not ask. She arranged. While the king refused her father in the war chamber, Seraphine was already moving. She had told the frightened crowd exactly what they needed to hear. She had turned their fear into a blade and pointed it at the only target who could not fight back with politics or blood. And now she planned to use that blade before the truth could ever surface. She would not kill the girl herself. That was clumsy. That left marks. She would simply see that the Omega was taken to the lower gate at the height of the next assault, in the chaos where the Crovath could do what needed doing. A girl lost in the fighting. A tragedy. A curse finally lifted. And by the time anyone asked questions, Seraphine would be standing at the king's side, and questions had a way of dying there. She smiled to herself in the cold corridor. She did not feel cruel. She felt practical. That was always how the worst things were done. In the great hall, the crowd pressed closer to Marin. Fear made them bold. Grief made them hungry. They wanted someone to blame, and Seraphine had handed them a name. And now they wanted her to answer for a darkness she had not made. "What are you?" an elder demanded. "Witch, or curse, or worse?" "Send her away," a voice cried. "Before the next attack, before she dooms us all. She glows like the cursed moon itself." Marin stood in the center of it, and the old familiar feeling rose up to swallow her whole. The feeling of being surrounded by people who had already decided what she was. The feeling of standing alone in a crowd. The feeling she had carried since she was a child, watching the other children laugh together from behind a door that would never open for her. She had felt this her entire life, and here it was again, exactly as it had always been, except now they did not just dislike her. Now they were afraid of her. Now they wanted her gone. And this was the moment, the true test of it, because Marin had a choice. She could feel the light in her chest, and she knew now what it could do. She did not have to stand here and take their fear. She could let them see exactly what she was. She could turn their terror into something real. She could withhold her gift. Let the wounded suffer. Let the kingdom fall to the Crovath. And watch every cruel face in this hall learn the cost of casting her out. They had earned it. Some quiet, aching part of her whispered that they had earned it. The mother who had laughed. The elder who called her witch. The whole gathered crowd who had cheered her rejection a day ago and now wanted her thrown to the enemy. She could walk away and let them reap exactly what they had sown. No one would even blame her. But she looked at them, really looked, and past the fear in their faces, she saw the children clutched against their legs, the wounds they were trying to hide, the grief for the ones already lost in the valley. They were frightened. They were cruel because they were frightened. And frightened people, she understood now, were not so different from a lonely child knocking at a door, desperate for someone to make the dark less terrifying. They had been wrong about her. Horribly, repeatedly wrong. But if she abandoned them now, if she let them die to teach them a lesson, then she would be exactly what they accused her of being. And worse than that, she would become the thing the cruelty had always tried to make her: bitter, hollow. A heart turned to stone because the world had been hard. That was the real curse, not the gold in the sky. The slow turning of a wounded heart into a weapon. Marin would not give them that. "I am not your curse," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The crowd hushed. "I do not know everything I am," she went on. "I am still learning it myself, but I know this. I have spent every hour since the battle began with my hands inside your wounds. I have mended your children. I have eased your dying. I have given you everything I have, and you have repaid it by deciding I must be the darkness." She swept her gaze across them. She did not flinch from a single face. "You are afraid. I understand fear. I have lived inside it my whole life because of people who looked at me exactly the way you are looking at me now." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And I could leave you to it. I could let the Crovath come. I could walk into the dark and take my gift with me, and you would learn, too late, what you threw away. A breath. But I will not, because I am not what you have decided I am. I never was." She lifted her chin. "When the enemy comes, I will stand on the wall with the rest of you, not because you deserve it, because it is right, and because I would rather lose everything as myself than survive as the thing your cruelty wanted to turn me into." The hall was silent. Some lowered their eyes. The mother she had saved was weeping again. Even the elder who had called her witch could not hold her gaze. But Seraphine, watching from the edge of the crowd, only smiled because the girl had just done the most convenient thing imaginable. She had promised to stand on the wall, at the lower gate, in the chaos of the next assault, exactly where Seraphine needed her to be. Far above the palace, the golden moon began, very slowly, to pulse. The veil between the worlds had worn nearly through. The patient presence that had watched Marin her whole life felt the moment approaching, the way a mother feels a long labor reaching its end. Soon, very soon now. The hour of hiding was almost over, but not yet. There was one more dark to pass through first. And as the kingdom braced for the final assault, as warriors sharpened blades and mothers held their children close, and the king paced the war chamber with the bond aching in his chest, Marin walked toward the lower gate, alone, straight into the trap that had been laid for her. And the light in her chest, for the first time all night, went very, very quiet, as though even it was holding its breath for what came next. The lower gate stood at the foot of the valley, where the wall met the dark. Marin reached it as the first horns of the Crovath sounded in the passes. She had come to stand with the others, exactly as she had promised. No one had asked her to. No one had wanted her to. But she had given her word in the great hall, before all of them. And a promise was one of the few things in her life that had ever belonged entirely to her. She found a place along the wall among warriors who would not meet her eyes. She set her hands on the cold stone. She waited, and the light in her chest stayed strangely quiet. It had roared all night. It had poured from her hands into dying children and surged toward the king in the dark corridor. But here, at the gate, with the horns echoing down the valley, it coiled itself small and still inside her, like a held breath. She did not know yet that the breath was a warning. The attack came down the valley like a black tide. The Crovath had waited generations for a night the moon could not protect, and now they spent all that patience at once. They came in a wave that swallowed the dark, hundreds of them, more than the scouts had counted, and they did not come like an army. They came like weather, like a thing that could not be reasoned with or turned aside. The kingdom's wolves met them at the wall with everything they had left. It was not enough. The blessing had nearly died. The pack's bond to the moon flickered and failed with every heartbeat, and without it, their strength was only the strength of tired, frightened wolves against an enemy who could already taste the victory in the air. Marin felt the line begin to bend before she saw it. She felt it in the rising panic. in the way the shouts changed pitch, in the way the warriors near her drew tighter and grimmer. The wall held. Then it strained. Then, somewhere down its length, it began to break, and in the chaos, the trap closed. It happened the way Seraphine had arranged it. A cry went up that the lower gate was failing, that the enemy had found a weakness, that the line needed to fall back and reform. Bodies surged in the dark. Orders collided. And in the press and the panic, hands that Marin never saw took hold of the great bar that held the gate shut. They drew it back. The doors groaned open onto the dark and the cold and the enemy beyond. And someone shoved her forward. Hard. Marin stumbled through the open gate, out past the wall, out into the no place between her own people and the oncoming tide. She caught herself on the frozen ground. She spun, and she saw the doors already swinging shut behind her, the gap between them narrowing fast. She saw the faces in that gap. She saw, just for an instant, golden hair and a small, cold, satisfied smile. And then the gate boomed closed, and the bar slammed home with a sound like a coffin lid. And Marin Holloway stood alone on the wrong side of the wall, with hundreds of the enemy bearing down on her through the dark. The realization arrived all at once. She had been handed to them, not by accident, not by the blind chaos of battle. Someone had opened that gate and pushed her through it and sealed her outside on purpose, and she knew, with a cold and total certainty, exactly whose smile she had glimpsed in the closing gap. Seraphine had not waited for the king's permission. Seraphine had simply arranged for the curse to disappear. Quietly, in the confusion. A girl lost in the fighting, a tragedy. A darkness finally lifted, and no one left alive to ask the questions. Marin stood very still in the freezing dark. The enemy poured toward her down the valley, a wall of shapes and snarls and gleaming eyes. Her own gate was barred behind her. The wall she had come to defend now defended itself against her. The whole world had narrowed to this single, terrible point, and it had the exact shape of every fear she had carried her entire life. Cast out, abandoned, alone in the dark, with the door shut against her. And something in her, at last, broke, not into despair, into clarity, because she had spent 22 years standing on the wrong side of doors. She had spent 22 years being pushed out, left behind, told in 100 quiet ways that she did not belong, that there was no place set for her, that the warmth on the other side of the wood was for someone else. And every single one of those times, she had believed the same soft, poisonous lie, that a door deciding to shut on her meant something true about her worth. Standing in the dark now, with death rushing toward her across the snow, Marin finally understood that it never had. The door had never been a verdict. It had only ever been a door. The cruelty of others had never been a measure of what she was. It had only ever been a measure of what they were. And all those years she had spent knocking, aching, certain the silence on the other side was her own fault. She had been wrong. She had always been wrong. She lifted her head, and the light in her chest, which had gone so quiet, so still, so patient all through the long night, woke. It did not come gently this time. It rose from the deepest place in her, from the lonely child who had grown up talking to the moon, from the discarded girl in the courtyard, from the woman who had pressed her palm to a king's chest and refused to be wanted only when useful. It rose from 22 years of being told she was nothing, and it carried with it the answer she had spent her whole life waiting to hear. You were never nothing. You were hidden. The light burst out of her. It poured from her chest, her hands, her skin, a great rolling wave of silver and gold that lit the valley like a second dawn breaking out of season. It climbed the walls. It flooded the snow. It threw the towering ridges into sudden, blazing relief. The oncoming Crovath faltered. The light swept toward them and broke against them like a tide against stone, and where it touched, their charge simply stopped. Not in death, in awe, in the deep, instinctive, animal recognition of a power far older than any war, older than borders, older than the grudges that had driven them across the passes. Weapons lowered, heads bowed. The black tide ground to a halt at the edge of the gold. The whole valley turned to light, and on the wall above, the wolves of the kingdom shielded their eyes and stared down at the girl they had cast out, standing alone beyond the gate they had sealed against her, blazing like a fallen star in the snow. Caspian saw it from the high wall. He had been fighting near the keep when the light erupted, and the bond in his chest had screamed and then sung, a single note of recognition so strong it dropped his blade from his hand. He had turned, and he had seen the valley fill with gold. He found her at the heart of it, standing outside the gate, alone, surrounded. And he understood at once what had been done. The gate she stood beyond did not fail on its own. Someone had opened it. Someone had put her there. The gate, he roared, and his voice cracked across the wall. Who opened the lower gate? But there was no time for answers. The light was still rising. And as Caspian watched, frozen, the gold around Marin began to gather, to climb, to spiral upward toward the swollen golden moon that hung over them all. And the moon answered. A column of silver light descended from the heavens. It fell upon the valley with a sound like the whole world exhaling at once. It struck the earth exactly where Marin stood, and the brightness of it forced every wolf, friend and enemy alike, down to their knees. The Crovath dropped what blades they still held. The kingdom's warriors bowed their heads against the glare. The very stones of the wall seemed to hum. And in the heart of that impossible radiance, where there had been one figure, now there were two. The light dimmed, slowly, into something the eye could bear, and the kingdom saw her. A woman stood beside Marin. Her gown flowed like moonlight poured over still water, never quite settling, never quite still. Her hair held threads of silver and gold that caught a light with no source, and the air around her carried a scent the whole valley knew without ever having smelled it before. Wild flowers and rain and something ancient that lived in the oldest stories, the ones whispered to children on the longest nights of winter. The moon goddess had come. A sound moved through the gathered wolves, low and trembling, as thousands of them pressed their faces to the cold ground. Even the Crovath, who had crossed the border to take this kingdom by the throat, knelt in the snow with their heads bowed low. There are some powers no enemy is fool enough to defy. Only Marin remained standing. She turned and she looked at the woman beside her, and the light in her chest, the light she had carried her whole life without ever understanding it, surged toward the goddess, like a child running across a long, long distance into the only arms that had ever truly been open. The goddess looked at her daughter, and she smiled. It was not the smile of a stranger. It was the smile of someone who had waited a very, very long time. This kind of smile that holds years inside it, years of watching from far away, close enough to ache, too far to reach, years of seeing a child stand alone at the edge of every gathering and being unable to cross the distance and take her hand. Marin, the goddess said, just the name, but the tenderness in it nearly brought the girl to her knees. The goddess lifted a hand and laid it gently upon Marin's shoulder. The touch sent warmth flooding through her whole body, a warmth that felt like coming home to a place she had never been, but had somehow always missed. Her eyes filled. She did not know why. She only knew that being touched like that, with that much tenderness, undid something in her that 22 years of loneliness had wound very tight. Then the goddess turned to face the kingdom, and her voice rolled out across the valley, across the wall, across the kneeling thousands, and the frozen enemy, and the king standing pale and silent upon the keep. "This," she said, "is my only daughter." The words struck the kingdom like thunder. No one moved. No one breathed. The truth landed on every wolf at once, and they understood, in a single devastating instant, exactly what they had done. The forgotten Omega, the girl with no name, the one they had laughed at and whispered about and cast out into the dark to die at the hands of the enemy. She was the child of the heavens. She had walked among them the whole time, for all her years, the goddess said, and her voice carried no anger, which somehow made it land far heavier than anger could have. My daughter lived among you unseen, not because she lacked worth, but because true worth is revealed only in how the powerful treat those who appear to have nothing to offer them. Her gaze swept slowly across the kneeling crowd. It paused on the faces that had laughed in the courtyard, on the elder who had called her witch, on the mother who had wept over her saved child, and then, hours later, let herself doubt. You looked at a girl with no title, the goddess said, and you decided you already knew everything she was. You weighed her by what she could give you, and when she seemed to offer nothing, you threw her away without a second thought. She let the silence stretch until it ached. That, she said softly, is the only curse that ever touched this kingdom, not the gold in the sky, not the dying flame. Those were only the heavens grieving for a child unloved. The curse was always inside you, in every heart that decides a person's worth by their usefulness, and discards them the moment they seem to have none. And then the goddess turned, slowly, toward the wall, toward the lower gate, toward the woman with golden hair who had not knelt, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd with her flawless composure cracking apart at last. "Seraphine." "You," the goddess said. The single word fell like a stone into still water. Seraphine's face had gone white as the snow. Her father's warriors, who had stood at her shoulder all night, drew back from her now, just slightly, the way men draw back from someone the heavens themselves have named aloud. "You opened the gate," the goddess said. "You handed a child of mine to the dark to keep a position you believed was yours by right. You spent this whole long night teaching the frightened to fear her. You took their grief, and you sharpened it into a blade, and you aimed it at the one heart in this kingdom that chose, even after all of it, even after being cast out, to stand on the wall and protect you. The whole valley watched. There is no punishment I need to give you, the goddess said. You have already become it. A person who measures everything by what it can do for her ends her days with nothing she did not purchase, and no one beside her who was not bought. You wanted a position. Keep it, and you will stand inside it utterly alone, surrounded by people who now know exactly what you are. She did not raise a hand. She did not call down fire. She did not have to, because all around the woman with golden hair, her supporters were already stepping away. The wolves who had praised her, the nobles who had courted her favor, the warriors who had bowed to her family's wealth. One by one they edged back and turned their faces and left her standing in a slowly widening circle of cold and empty space. The contempt she had aimed at others all her life had simply found its way home. It was the loneliest thing the kingdom had ever seen. And then the goddess turned, last of all, toward the king. Caspian came down from the keep. He crossed the valley on foot, through the kneeling thousands, past the lowered blades of the enemy, past the bowed heads of his own warriors. He walked the whole length of it in silence, and the bond in his chest dragged at him with every step, wounded and aching and undeniable. He came to a stop a short distance from the woman of moonlight and the daughter she had finally claimed before the world. He looked at Marin, and then, before the entire kingdom, the Alpha King lowered himself to his knees in the snow. A gasp moved through the crowd. A king did not kneel. A king had never knelt, not in living memory, not in the oldest stories. But Caspian Thorn knelt now in the gold and silver light, and when he lifted his face, there was no crown left in it at all. Only a man. I judged what I could see, he said. His voice was rough, and it carried in the vast silence. And I refused to look any deeper. I stood before all of you, and I called her nothing. I let you laugh, and I called it duty. He drew a breath that shook in his chest. It was not duty. It was the easiest thing. And it was the worst thing I have ever done in my life. The goddess regarded him for a long moment. You were given a choice, she said. On the night of the ceremony, the bond between you and my daughter was real. It was true. It was the rarest gift the heavens can offer to souls. Caspian closed his eyes. And you broke it, the goddess said, the moment you spoke your rejection. Not all at once. A bond does not die in an instant. It bleeds, and it withers, and it dies by inches, exactly as you have felt it dying in your chest all night long. But the wound was mortal from the first word. The bond that might have carried you both was lost, before you ever understood what you were holding in your hands. The words landed on Caspian like a sentence read aloud. He bowed his head. He had known it already. He had felt it all night, the bond aching and raw between them, never whole, never healing, bleeding into both of them with every hour. But to hear it spoken plainly, before the whole kingdom, by the mother of the woman he had thrown away, it broke something in him that no enemy ever had. I know, he said quietly. I have felt it. The bond is dying. I killed it. I will not pretend otherwise. He lifted his eyes to Maren, and there was no demand in them, none at all, no plea for what he had lost, only grief and a terrible, naked honesty. I do not ask for it back. I have no right to ask for anything from you. He held her gaze. I only wanted you to hear me say it, in front of everyone, the same way I wronged you. You were never nothing, Maren. You were the most worthy soul in this kingdom, and I was far too small to see it. The fault was mine. It was always mine, and it always will be. The valley held its breath. The Crovath knelt in the snow. The kingdom knelt along the wall. Seraphine stood alone in her circle of empty cold. And in the heart of the silver light, the daughter of the heavens looked down at the king who had rejected her, now kneeling in the snow with his crown forgotten and his pride in ruins at her feet. And Maren felt the strangest thing, not triumph. She had thought, somewhere in the bitter and lonely corners of all those years, that a moment exactly like this one would feel like triumph. To stand in the light while the ones who had scorned her knelt in the snow. To watch the proud king humble himself before the whole world. To be revealed at last as something far greater than any of them had ever dared to dream. It did not feel like triumph. It felt quiet. It felt like the end of a very long road, with the door finally open, and the strange, dizzying discovery that the open door no longer mattered nearly as much as she had spent her whole life believing it would. Because somewhere on that long, cold walk to reach it, she had stopped needing it to open. The goddess looked at her daughter and read all of it in her face. The kingdom has seen you now, she said softly. All of it. Every one of them. The way it should have seen you from the very first day you walked among them. She reached out and touched Maren's cheek, gentle as moonlight on water. But seeing is the kingdom's gift to give too late. What comes next? That belongs to no one but you. She stepped back. The silver light gathered around them both, rising, brightening, beginning to lift them up toward the patient golden moon. Come, the goddess said, and her voice was full of a tenderness 22 years deep. There is something I have waited your whole life to tell you, and there is a choice that only you can make. And as the kingdom knelt below them in the gold and silver dawn, mother and daughter turned together toward the light, and the last veil between the worlds fell away. The light carried them up, and the world fell away beneath them. Maren did not feel afraid. That surprised her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she had spent her whole life braced for the next loss, the next door, the next cold turning away. Fear had been her constant companion, the quiet hum beneath everything. And now she rose through a column of silver light with the earth shrinking below, and the fear simply was not there. In its place was the warmth, and the woman beside her. They came to rest in a place that was not quite a place. There was no ground, and yet they stood. There was no sky, and yet light moved above them, soft and endless, the pale color of the moon on water. All around them, faint and shimmering, hung what looked like a garden, though the flowers were made of light and the trees swayed in a wind that made no sound. It was beautiful in a way that ached, because some part of Maren recognized it. Not from memory, from somewhere older than memory. The way a song you have never heard can still bring tears, because it touches a place that was waiting for it all along. You have been here before, the goddess said softly, watching her face. When you were very small, before you could hold a memory in your hands. Maren turned to her. Why don't I remember? Because remembering would have made the years unbearable, the goddess said. And the years had to be born. She gestured, and 2 seats of pale light formed from the air, and they sat together, mother and daughter, in the garden that was made of moonlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Maren looked at the woman beside her and tried to find the words for the question that had lived in her chest her entire life. There were so many. They crowded behind her teeth, and in the end, the one that came out was the smallest of them, and the largest. Why did you leave me there? Her voice did not accuse. It only asked. The goddess closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet with a grief that looked far too human for a creature of the heavens. That, she said, is the question I have waited 22 years to answer. Long ago, the goddess began, the kingdom below grew proud. They wore my blessing like a jewel they had earned, rather than a gift they had been given. They began to measure one another the way the wealthy measure coins. By bloodline, by strength, by usefulness. The strong were honored. The weak were forgotten. And those who seemed to have nothing to offer were treated as though they were nothing at all. Maren listened. She knew that kingdom. She had lived her whole life in its shadow. I could have struck them down, the goddess said. I could have ended their cruelty with a single word, but cruelty cannot be ended from above. It can only be cured from within. And so I chose something harder. I chose to hide a child among them, my own, stripped of every advantage, no name, no title, no power anyone could see. Her voice grew very quiet. A test, not of her, of them, to see whether a single heart in all that kingdom would look at a girl who seemed to offer nothing and choose to treat her with kindness anyway. Maren felt something tighten in her chest. So I was bait, she said slowly. A trap you set for them. No. The goddess reached out and took her daughter's hands, and her touch was warm, achingly warm. You were never bait, my love. You were the bravest thing I have ever sent into that world. Because the test could only be true if the child did not know she was being watched, if she did not know that her loneliness had a purpose, if she believed every single day that she was simply unwanted. Tears slid down Maren's face now. She did not try to stop them. You felt it, she whispered, all of it. You saw. I saw everything. And now the goddess wept too, silver tears that fell and turned to light before they reached the ground. I saw you sick and alone, with no one to bring you water. I saw you set a second place at the table for no one, just so a chair would not stand empty. I saw you at the edge of every gathering, watching the other children, aching to be invited in. I saw the courtyard. I saw the laughter. I saw a king tell my daughter she was nothing, and I had to hold myself back from tearing the sky in half. She pressed Maren's hands to her own cheek. There were nights, she said, when watching you was the closest thing to dying that an immortal can know. Maren broke. All of it came at once. 22 years of believing she was forgotten. 22 years of believing the silence on the other side of every door was a verdict on her worth. 22 years of carrying the loneliness alone, certain that no one had ever truly seen her, certain that she had been left behind because she did not matter enough to keep. And now, here in a garden made of light, she learned the truth. She had been seen, every moment, every night, every tear. There had been eyes on her the entire time, and they had not been cold. They had been a mother's eyes, watching from too far away, weeping at a distance she could not cross. "You never abandoned me," Maren said, and the words came out shattered. Never. The goddess gathered her daughter into her arms, and Maren let herself be held, truly held, for what felt like the first time in her entire life. Not for one breath, not for one heartbeat. I was with you in every lonely room. I was the warmth in your chest when there was no one else. I was the moon you spoke to in the dark. She pressed her lips to Maren's hair. You thought you were talking to nothing all those nights. You were talking to me, and I heard every word. They stayed like that for a long time. There was no time in that place, so it could have been a moment or an age. Maren did not care. She had spent her whole life starved for exactly this, and now that she had it, she did not want to let go. But slowly, the weeping quieted, and the goddess drew back and held her daughter's face in both hands and looked at her with a pride so fierce it was almost frightening. "And do you understand now," she said, "what you did?" Maren shook her head. "The kingdom failed the test," the goddess said, "almost entirely. They saw a girl with nothing, and they offered her cruelty. The king failed it most of all." A pause. "But you did not fail, Maren. You were the one being tested without knowing it, and you still passed the only test that ever mattered." "I don't understand." "When they cast you out," the goddess said, "you had every reason to become like them. Hard, bitter. A heart turned to stone by a world that gave you only stone in return. You held a power that could have made them suffer. You stood at a gate with a choice in your hands." Her eyes shone. "And you chose to stand on the wall and protect the very people who had thrown you away. Not because they deserved it, because it was right." She smiled through her tears. "The kingdom forgot how to treat those who seemed to have nothing. And the one person they treated as nothing was the only one who remembered." Maren was quiet for a long while. Something was settling inside her. Something large and slow, like a great stone finally finding the bottom of a deep, deep well after falling for years. "All this time," she said softly, "I thought the loneliness meant something was wrong with me. I know you did. I thought I was being punished for some flaw I could never find." She looked up, and it was the opposite. The loneliness was not because I was worth less. It was because I was being asked to carry more. "Yes," the goddess whispered, "my brave, brave girl. Yes." The garden of light shifted around them, and the goddess rose, and her expression changed, and Maren understood that the time had come for the thing she had been brought here to face. "There is a choice before you," the goddess said, "and it is yours alone. No one can make it for you. Not me, not the kingdom, not the king who knelt in the snow." She lifted one hand, and the light parted to show two paths. The first was the garden itself, opening outward into a realm of endless, gentle radiance, a place of peace, a place where the light in Marin's chest could finally rest, a place of belonging so complete that loneliness could never follow her there again. "You can come home with me," the goddess said, "to the realm of your birth. You will never be cold again. You will never be alone again. You will never stand outside another door for as long as the heavens endure. You will be with me, and you will be loved, and you will be safe. Forever." It was everything Marin had ever wanted. Everything the lonely child had begged for in the dark. And then the goddess lifted her other hand, and the light parted to show the second path, the valley below, the kingdom, the wall, and the gate, the snow stained with the long night's battle, the wounded still lying in the great hall, the frightened wolves who had cast her out, and the men knelt at the truth, the king on his knees in the cold, the forest she loved, the roads she knew, the small, imperfect, painful world that had given her so little and asked of her so much. "Or you can stay," the goddess said quietly, "in a world that hurt you, a world that may hurt you again, a world full of people who are cruel because they are frightened, and frightened because they are small, and small because no one ever taught them to be otherwise." She paused. "It is not a kind world, Marin. You know that better than anyone alive." Marin looked at the two paths for a long, long time. The garden of endless peace, the valley of endless struggle, and she was surprised to find that the choice was not as hard as it should have been. "If I leave," she said slowly, "what happens to them?" The goddess studied her. "The blessing would return," she said. "The wrong has been made right. The moon will turn silver again, whether you stay or go. They would not be punished for your leaving. That is not what I asked." Marin's voice was steady now. "I asked what happens to them, to the ones who are cruel because they are frightened. If I go to a place where loneliness can never reach me, who teaches them? Who shows them another way?" She looked at the kingdom below. "They failed the test," she said. "You said so. They saw someone with nothing, and they offered cruelty. But a test you fail is not the end of the story. It is only the part where you learn." She turned back to her mother. "If everyone who is treated cruelly simply leaves for somewhere kinder, then the cruel world never changes. It just loses all its gentle people one by one until there is no one left to teach it anything." The goddess said nothing, but her eyes were shining. "I spent my whole life," Marin went on, "wishing someone would see me. And now they have. The whole kingdom has. And I have learned something I did not expect to learn." She drew a slow breath. "Being seen does not heal the years. It does not reach back and hold the lonely child. I thought it would. I thought if they finally saw my worth, the wound would close. But it did not." "Then what did?" the goddess asked softly. Marin almost laughed. "Knowing it myself," she said. "Standing outside that gate with the door shut and the enemy coming, and finally understanding that the door was never a verdict, that nothing they ever decided about me was true, that my worth was never theirs to grant or take away." Her voice grew quiet and certain. "I did not need them to see me. I needed to see myself. And now that I do, I am not afraid of their world anymore." She looked at the Garden of Peace one last time, the endless warmth, the place where she would never hurt again, and she turned away from it. "I want to stay," she said. The goddess was silent for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was the smile of a mother who had hoped, against all hope, to hear exactly those words. "I prayed you would choose this," she said, "and I feared you would, both at once. That is what it is, to love a brave child." She reached out and touched Marin's forehead, gentle as the first light of dawn. "You will carry my gift with you. You will heal. You will protect. And you will teach that kingdom, by the simple fact of your living, what they failed to learn from your suffering." "And you?" Marin asked. "Will I see you again?" "You have always seen me," the goddess said, "every night, in the sky, in the light beneath your ribs." She smiled. "I never left you when you thought you were alone. I will not leave you now that you know you never were." The light gathered, and the world rushed back. Marin stood once more in the valley, in the snow, beneath the great golden moon, and the silver light set her down as gently as a mother laying a child to sleep. The whole kingdom was still kneeling. They lifted their heads as she returned, alone now, the goddess gone, and a sound moved through the crowd that was not fear and was not awe. It was something quieter, something heavier, the sound of thousands of people who had finally understood what they had done and could never again pretend they had not. The goddess's voice came one last time from everywhere and nowhere, rolling across the valley like the last note of a song. "Remember this," she said, "all of you. Her worth was never hidden because it was small. It was hidden because you were not looking. You measured a soul by what she could give you, and you missed the greatest gift that ever walked among you." A pause. A person's true worth is not in their station. It is not in their bloodline, or their strength, or their use to you. It is in who they are when no title protects them, and how you treat such a person is the only true measure of who you are. The light brightened once, blindingly, and then, slowly, the moon began to change. The gold faded. The silver returned. The blessing flowed back into the land like warmth into frozen fingers, and all across the kingdom the dead hearth fires sparked and caught and bloomed back to life. The wolves felt their bond to the moon mend in their chests. The Crovath, kneeling in the snow, rose slowly and looked at one another, and turned without a word to begin the long walk back toward the passes. The war was over. There was nothing here to take. There never had been, and the night, at last, grew still. Caspian was still kneeling when she reached him. He had not moved the entire time. He knelt in the trampled snow with his head bowed, and when her shadow fell across him, he looked up, and his face was open in a way she had never seen on a king. "You came back," he said. "I chose to come back," she answered. "There is a difference." He nodded slowly. He understood. For a moment, neither spoke. The bond between them was quiet now, a faint and fading ache, like the memory of a wound rather than the wound itself. It was almost gone. They both felt it. And strangely, this going of it hurt less than either of them had feared, because it left room for something that had to be built rather than given. "I know the bond is all but gone," Caspian said. "I killed it the night I called you nothing. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not ask you to mourn what I destroyed." He rose, slowly, to his feet, but there was nothing of the proud king in the way he stood. I only want you to know that I see you now, truly, not the daughter of the heavens, not the power that saved my kingdom. You, the woman who stood on a wall to protect people who had thrown her away. He paused. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen. And I will spend the rest of my life ashamed that I needed the whole sky to light up before I could see it. Marin looked at him for a long time, and she found, to her quiet surprise, that she felt no hatred. The bitterness she might have nursed, the revenge she might have taken, the cold satisfaction of watching him suffer for what he had done, none of it was in her. It had burned away somewhere on the long road to the gate, and in the garden of light, and in the choosing to come back. But she felt no rush to forgive him either. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not a gift you owed someone simply because they had finally said the right words. It was a road, and roads took time to walk. You hurt me, she said simply. In front of everyone. You called me nothing, and you let them laugh. And then the moment I became useful, you wanted me. I cannot pretend that did not happen. I will not pretend it did not happen, just to make this moment easier for you. Caspian bowed his head. I know. But, she said, and he looked up, I am not the lonely girl who walked out of that courtyard anymore. I do not need your apology to know my worth. And because I do not need it, I can hear it honestly. And I believe that you mean it. She paused. That is not forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness is something I would have to choose, slowly, over a long time, the way I chose to come back, the way I chose myself. Her eyes met his, steady and clear. Maybe someday, if you become someone worth choosing, if I decide I want to walk that road. And today, he asked quietly. A faint smile touched her mouth. It was not unkind. It was simply true. Today, she said, I choose myself. Caspian nodded, and this time there was no protest in it, no wounded pride, no king's expectation that the world would arrange itself to his liking. Only a man who had learned, far too late, that some things cannot be commanded, or bought, or seized. They can only be earned, and earning takes a lifetime, and is not owed at the end of it. Then I will be here, he said, not waiting. I have no right to make you a debt I expect you to pay, but living, trying to become someone who would have treated you with kindness when you had nothing. He drew a breath. And if that day ever comes, I will count it a gift I did not deserve. Good, Marin said softly. That is the right answer. And it was. The first light of dawn appeared over the eastern ridge. It came slowly, the way dawn always does, spilling pale gold across the snow, touching the wall and the gate and the trampled valley, warming the faces of the kneeling wolves who rose now, one by one, to meet it. Marin turned away from the king and walked a little distance, to where the slope fell away and the whole kingdom lay spread beneath her. The villages, the forests, the roads she had walked alone so many times, the small, imperfect, painful world she had just chosen, with her eyes wide open, over a garden of endless peace. She stood at the edge of the dawn and breathed, and the light in her chest glowed steady and sure, the way it always would now, because she finally understood what it had always been. Not a flaw, not a punishment, not a sign of something broken or wrong or unworthy. A mother's love watching from the sky, and the seed of her own light, which had been there the whole time, waiting only for her to stop looking at the closed doors of others and turn, at last, to see herself. The lonely child she had been would never fully leave her. Maren knew that. The years could not be unlived. The nights could not be wept away now. She would carry that small, lonely girl, the one who had knocked at doors that never opened and talked to the moon when no one else would listen, inside her for the rest of her days. But she would carry her gently now, the way she should always have been carried, the way the moon had carried Maren all along. She watched the sun climb over the ridge and pour its gold across the kingdom that had failed her, and then, too late, learned to see her. And standing there, between the fading moon and the rising sun, with her whole imperfect future stretched out before her and chosen freely with her own two hands, Maren Holloway finally understood the truth that 22 years of loneliness had been trying all along to teach her. She had never been lost. She had never been forgotten. She had never, not for one single moment, been nothing. The world had simply needed time to learn how to see her, and she had needed that time too, to learn how to see herself.